Well, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar titled The Enemies of Judgement with Gary Honey, founder of Chiron Risk. And we're very glad to see you here with us today. My name is Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at ZN, and my role this morning is to chair and to moderate the session. Just a word of thanks first to our sponsors. We're very fortunate at the FS Club to have a range of sponsors who enable us to run this webinar programs and other events, and indeed to go widely across the fields of economics, finance, technology, and science, and many other subjects as well. A brief word on the program today. My role, as I said, is to moderate and really to introduce and then get out of the way so that we can hear from Gary, our keynote presenter today, and then also to moderate the Q&A session at the end. And if you haven't used GoToWebinar before, the way to put in a question or make an observation is to find the question tab on the dashboard on your screen, type in your question. That will come to us, and I'll be able to moderate those during the Q&A session. And please do put a question at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A at the end. So if something strikes you, do put it in. And we will put you in touch if you do ask a question or observation. We'll share your contact details with Gary so that if there's any need for any follow-up discussion, that can take place. And finally, by way of housekeeping, just so we are recording the session today, so that if you want to go back and remind yourself of the content, or if you have friends and colleagues that you think might be interested, the recording will be available in around 24 hours and posted on the website. So that'll be available for you to share or to go back and rewatch. So I think that's all by way of introductions. Gary is a thinker about, I guess, risk and judgment. He's the author of Navigating Uncertainty, Securing Better Judgment, and trains board directors and others in leadership, risk, and managing that risk. And just before the session, we were just sharing that certainly early in my career, I was always taught that to take a perfect decision, you need complete information. A good manager's job, therefore, is to take good decisions with imperfect information, always allowing that the perfect manager can obviously take perfect decisions with no information at all. And somewhere along the spectrum of that is where I suspect we need to be. So it's a really, really great pleasure to introduce Gary Honey, founder of Chiron Risk. Gary, the floor is yours. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Just take remote control. Here we go. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this short chat. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes, and I hope you'll have some questions at the end of it. Hello, there we are. I think I've had the introduction from Mike there. I've worked with Henley Business School for a number of years, and I work in board development programs, helping boards get the right skill set for dealing with things like risk. So having worked in risk for over 20 years, my thinking now is that we look at risk in order to understand judgment, and we explore risk to secure good judgment. That's what we look at risk for. When you look at the crises of the last 20 years, everyone was not on a risk register. Things come about and people haven't thought of them, and you can't predict the future. So a judgment is a combination of the information we've got and an estimation for the gaps of the information we haven't got. So my contention is that estimation is where we paper over our ignorance. And I use the word ignorance. It's quite a pejorative word. It's quite a harsh word, but it is where we put in a subjective element for something about the future that we can't know about. And I think it's very important we look at ignorance. For those of you who've been listening to the Radio 4 series by Rory Stewart over the last few weeks, marvelous sessions on ignorance, much more than I'm covering, quasi-philosophical, quasi all sorts of things. But ignorance is a subject that there's been quite a lot written about recently, and I'm about to show you some of the latest readings on that and papers on that. And the other element of this, there are two stages to this talk, is to talk about bias and cognitive bias. And obviously, it's been around for a long time. It's been known about for over 20 years since behavioral economics was first launched and understood. But I'm going to touch on some thoughts on that, and see where we go. So the premise today is to talk about the enemies of good judgment, which I put into two categories: ignorance and bias. Ignorance because of those things that we don't know, and there are two categories of that. There's the intractable uncertainty, which things which cannot be known. The number of times I've seen a risk register which has things on it which, frankly, no company could ever know, so why put them on there? And imperfect information, which is what could be known but isn't. And I think it's quite important to distinguish between those two things, because you can spend a lot of time as a director of a board or a board collectively worrying about intractable uncertainty, which will get you nowhere, and imperfect information. In the recent John Kay book on radical uncertainty, he talks about mysteries and puzzles. Puzzles can be solved and mysteries cannot. And on the second part of the talk, we're going to talk about bias, which is really what we think we know, and the perceptions and beliefs that we bring to that as an individual, and the prejudices and politics that we bring to it around the board table or in collective meetings where we are subject to the pressures of our peers. So I'm going to start with ignorance. And this, I'm afraid, is rather a wordy chart, but it is the only one in the set that has so many words on. And it's important because a couple of books recently that I'm going to refer to here, types of ignorance, which you may not be aware of, but you may find interesting. In a book called Motivated Ignorance, which came out 4 years ago, there's the concept of acquisitional ignorance versus motivated ignorance. Acquisitional ignorance is where we just don't want to find something out because it's just too expensive. It's not worth the trouble. The costs of getting that knowledge is just not worth it. Whereas motivated ignorance involves a form of ignorance that is driven not by the costs, but by an aversion to possessing it. One good example is for somebody who says, I don't want to get a test for cancer because I might discover something I'd rather not know. So there's a distinction between acquisitional and motivated in that particular publication. The second thing I'd like to talk about is this thing between deliberate and accidental. Now, I covered that a lot in my risk writing between deliberate risk and accidental risk blindness. Sorry, deliberate and accidental risk blindness. Deliberate ignorance is where there's a conscious choice not to seek information, not necessarily because the knowledge might prove disturbing, but you just don't really want to go there. For example, is that a burglar in my neighbour's house? Do I really want to find out, or should I just close the windows and close the curtains and forget about it? And the accidental ignorance is much more common in boards and group decisions in business, where the knowledge was assumed to be sufficient to make decisions, but subsequently found to be inadequate. Events turned out to show that you really didn't have enough information. So those two I take forward into a model I've developed here, which I think puts the intractable and imperfect information on the axis, the horizontal axis, and the accidental and deliberate on the vertical axis. Gives us four very simple scenarios here, if you like. If you look at the top left, where there is accidental ignorance because we don't know what can't be known. This is what the old Rumsfeld corner of unknown unknowns. So no point wasting time in that. If you move across to the top right and look at the accidental ignorance of what can be known but isn't, then you're not asking the right questions. And that's a very important thing for a board or a group to actually get their head around, is identifying what questions you should be asking. If we move down to the bottom right, deliberate ignorance with imperfect knowledge, we just don't want to know. And here again, there are examples in business and in public sector where where the ignorance is there because we don't want to know the answer. And we have to be honest about that. Moving across to the bottom left, where you have deliberate ignorance with those things that can't be known, there's no point in trying to find out. So again, don't waste time there. So I think the important thing is to identify what kind of ignorance we're dealing with. And I think a lot of boards who say, oh, we don't know that, and then try and make a decision, or we try and make a good decision, you know, haven't really delved down into this. For those of you who know Dunning-Kruger or have heard of Dunning-Kruger, it is the concept that those with least information are often the most confident. We see this with political leaders, we see this with business leaders, people who don't believe in too much detail. I know enough. And this is a lovely cartoon I found with, you know, let me interrupt your expertise with my confidence. I think we've all worked at some stage for a boss who was extremely confident in their own opinion and possibly not really backed up with a lot of evidence. Moving on, how do you respond to ignorance? Two very simple routes here. The blue one is considered the good one. You accept and mitigate, you develop risk resilience, and you reduce uncertainty, so you have contingencies in place. But the red one is what often happens, where you deny and ignore the risk, and you exude confidence, and you manufacture certainty. There's a tendency for many boards, I find, to manufacture certainty because it's what their shareholders expect, or it's what the regulator expects, or it's what their customers expect. And that's fine, but you are then hubristic, and you're hopeful of a preferred outcome, but you're not guaranteeing it. Confidence is no guarantee of accuracy. Moving on, predicting the future. I think this is quite important. The word cloud here is one I developed for my book, but you probably could do your own one. This is only about 25 words. There's probably many more we could put in. But I pick out 4. Estimation is where we envision a future outcome, and risk is ultimately an estimate of a future outcome. So there's no right answers in risk. And like strategy, it's just a view of the future. Prediction carries a risk. You can be lucky or wrong. For those of you watching the Olympics last night, all the pundits were saying this particular chap's guaranteed a gold medal. He's broken all the records this year. Nobody's beaten him, guaranteed. Lo and behold, he comes in second, beaten by somebody who was 37-1 against. So prediction is dangerous because you can't always be right. Foresight recognizes alternative future outcomes, and most of the foresight agencies I work with use matrices of alternative outcomes because that helps organizations with long-term planning. There is no one guaranteed outcome. And confidence, this whole thing about senior people, whether a board or CEO, whoever, CRO even, if they're confident, is that really based on good judgment, or is that based on the fact they feel they need to exude confidence? So that's quite... Now here we come to the 3 points really on the decision dilemma. How much is enough information to make a decision? Question 1, do we have enough reliable information to make informed decisions? If not, 2, are we clear how much we are using assumptions to mask our ignorance? 3, do we live with this uncertainty, or should we wait for more information? So this whole idea of ignorance being a bridging tool, one of the people on one of my posts on judgment over the last few weeks said he thought he'd seen somewhere there was a rule that you've got to have 70% confidence before you can make a decision, but you've still got a 30% estimate in there. Is that enough? I don't know. So summarizing this first part, because I'm time limited here. Coping with ignorance, distinguish between imperfect information and intractable uncertainty, because that is a valuable answer. What is a mystery and what is a puzzle? And focus on tackling the imperfect information, solving the puzzles, and accept the intractable uncertainty. Just put the mysteries to one side. And beware of the information estimation ratio that you are working with. Is 60-40 enough, or should be going for 80-20? And if you need to go to 80-20, do you need to gather more to get to your 80? And then do you need to make the decision now, or should you defer until you've got the 80% information? And also identify what supports the estimation percentage. Is it experience? Is it intuition? Or is it trust? Now that's more or less where I am in the first session on ignorance. It's a bit of a rattle through. I think there's a lot more on ignorance to talk about. I have put some posts out on LinkedIn on this recently, But I'd be happy to hear if anyone's got any questions on ignorance and how it affects judgment. I'm going to move on to the second part here and talk a little bit more about bias and the impact of cognitive bias. Obviously, it's been recognized by behavioral science for 20 years and the term heuristics. But of course, this is about how we make rational decisions. We don't make rational decisions, we make emotional ones. And there are many studies on different types of bias and many academic studies on a number of different heuristics. I've seen one, don't try and understand this, saying that there are 118 different types of cognitive bias. I think that's a little over academic for most businesses. I tend to with boards where I'm working with, I tend to say, got to distinguish between whether the bias is brought to the table by you as an individual or the group responding to the dynamics of the group psychology. If it's an individual bias, it's probably developed from your own experience or belief, which is fine, but you can recognize that. But if it's a collective bias, it's a compound of culture and conventional wisdom in the organization. So I tend to work with 4 causal types, which is enough for most boards I work with, but is no way definitive. And I'm going to come on and suggest some other ideas. This is tend to be what I do. I say, right, at the individual level, you're bringing to the table a bias based on your familiarity with an issue, or your brain speed, which is to do with the Tversky fast and slow concept, which I think most of you understand, and your own personal loss aversion, which again, in financial investment circles, you will know. So you have your own personal perception that you bring to the table as a bias. Moving across to the top right, in groups, whether this is a boardroom or some other management committee or functional unit, you're making group decisions. So you have natural psychological things such as obedience to authority. You defer to the person who's chair, usually out of politeness, if nothing else, and you don't want to be seen as too awkward. So you'll be a pressure to have dissonance reduction so that people come to an agreement and you're consensual. And this can, of course, lead to what we now know is called groupthink, where too many people in the room have got the same ideas, the same thoughts, not enough diversity of opinion. Moving to the bottom left, there's another kind of bias I see, especially because some people like the non-execs are not in touch with the business daily. You have the executive committee who will work in the business daily and know the issues, and the NEDs who will parachute in every 3 to 6 months from board meetings, and they are driven by their time, which is limited, and looking for patterns of things that have happened in the past and to understand issues, hindsight bias, patterning bias, that sort of thing. Again, because quite often the people in the room have not all started from the same knowledge base. And the final one I tend to talk about is operational, where you're talking about specific projects, where those who have what they call skin in the game, those who are in charge of the project, are looking for signs that it's going well, and it's on budget, and it's on time, and we'll look for things that confirm this, and we'll filter out contradictory evidence. And we can think of recent examples in the press of companies that filter out inconvenient things that don't fit the narrative. And of course, escalation of commitment. We see that sometimes with large public sector projects where so much has already been spent. It's called, sunk cost. So those are the 4 types of bias I tend to work with. However, there are other ways of looking at it that might be more useful to some of you. If you put 2 axes again, one axis looks at the individual to collective spectrum, which I'll show you. This shows how bias emerges due to group dynamics, and what a bias you have may or may not be reinforced or challenged by the group. And the other axis I've chosen, which is controversial, is whether the issue, the bias, is actually a tactical one or a strategic one. And this looks at how the bias relates to the nature of the decision itself. The way I tend to do this is if you take the individual to collective horizontal axis, where you are at the far end and the group is at the other, and you look at the vertical axis, where you have a tactical perception at the top and a strategic one at the bottom, this allows you to start saying, okay, that kind of bias, for example, where it's individual and tactic, it's a habit such as loss aversion. Okay, moving across the top right, you could say, okay, collective tactical, obedience to authority, understandable, that fits there. Moving down to the bottom right, you have strategic collective, where it's sort of a policy decision, where there's tactical strategic collective over optimism, for example. Or bottom left, again back more into the individual, where it's individual strategic is hindsight, for example, is perception of an issue. So I drew that up really to try and push the types of bias I'm finding in boardrooms into 4 categories to make them easier to spot and easier to work with, whether they come from an individual source or a collective source, and whether they're essentially tactical or strategic. There are other ways of looking at that. You can step back and say, okay, the individual tactical ones are instinctive. The individual strategic ones are about ideas. And to what extent should we take ideas to a meeting? That's a whole can of worms, isn't it? On the right-hand side, the tactical collective is behavior and culture. And the strategic collective is then vision and how we see things. So again, that's another way of looking at it. And this takes us through to the final one, which I even more stepping back into doing, following, seeing, leading. The individual tactical is about doing, and the individual strategic is about seeing. And then moving on to the right-hand side, the tactical collective is about following, perhaps, and the collective strategic is about leading, where you all follow the following and leading. They sort of overlap. Not sure whether that really helps people. I found that quite useful in putting the 12 different biases I work with into categories so that organizations can finally say, okay, we do more of that and we do less of that and we should do more of that. Allows them to spatially start thinking about the way they look at cognitive bias. The important thing, I think, for any bias is the academics get wrapped up on spotting them. But for business, it's about how do you neutralize them or how do you work with them. And this is a huge challenge for an NED, because most people who are only in touch with a business as an outsider, who've got a role to keep an eye on the executive and hold them to account, they need to know, okay, I've seen this bias. It's no point me just telling the chairman there is bias. I need to do something about it. So there are certain things you can do. So with groupthink, you can encourage diversity. With dissonant reductions, you can encourage dissenting of views. With optimism bias, you listen to those with nothing to gain. With patterning bias, you avoid looking for patterns, obviously. And with loss aversion, you actually turn it on its head and say, okay, well, what is the opportunity for gain? Each type of bias needs a different type of neutralizing approach. It's like drugs and therapy almost. Okay, conclusion. Here we are. This is my concluding part. I contend that good judgment is hampered by twin enemies, ignorance and bias. Why do decisions need to be taken with imperfect knowledge? What underpins the estimation element? Is it simply gut feel? And for those who haven't seen it, I often refer to this book, which is fantastic, about a flaw in human judgment. Some good writing there. Because confidence is no guarantee of accuracy. A quote in that book, Noise, which I will conclude with: in order for you to feel confident in a judgment, 2 conditions must be satisfied. The story you believe must be comprehensively coherent, and there must be no attractive alternatives. Now, I'm drawing this to a conclusion now. There is one final slide, which I shall leave up if anyone's interested, because this isn't about me. This is stuff that is out there to read if you're interested. Going back to the first book I've looked on this with, Risk Savvy by Gerd Gigerenzer, who Max Planck Institute in Berlin, fantastic guy, quite written a few things. Then, of course, Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which was only written in 2011, but is sort of bedrock of behavioral economics. Tetlock and Gardner's book is even it came out in 2015, but was much promoted as the art and science of prediction. Very good read. Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, I find that fantastic because how to make smarter decisions. A paper I referred to, I think, was Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. Again, worth having a look at. The two I referred to early on in the ignorance stuff, Motivated Ignorance and Deliberate Ignorance, worth picking up on. Noise and a Flaw in Human Judgment, I think, is so important because we make assumptions that our judgment is great until such time as it's proven not to be. And a very new book, which I haven't got hold of yet, but The Intelligence of Intuition from Gerd Gigerenzer. So these things, if those of you who are interested might want to get more into this, I'm more than happy to come and talk to you or a group of people if you want to talk about this. But I'm not selling an answer here. I'm just saying I think we need to think more about the enemies of judgment and be aware of what we can do about them. Thank you very much. That's the end of my part. Back to Mike and any questions. Shall I move out off this? Shall I depart that page? There we go. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. That's a really good overview, I guess, of this question. I think it's a starting point. It struck me that there's also the question of time and whether time is also an enemy of judgment. Sometimes you need to make quick decisions. Sometimes decisions are time bound. Where does that come into the mix?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I put out a post a few weeks ago just after watching England playing New Zealand at rugby, for those of you who follow that sort of thing. And I noticed the referee had to make pretty quick decisions. He's got the benefit of TMO, a separate third party who can video referee, just as they do in football with a VAR. But a referee has to make pretty quick decisions, and he's got to make the large proportion of them right. So there are certain industries and certain skills where you haven't got the luxury of making decisions in anything other than almost instantly. I don't know whether there's anyone on the call from aviation, pilots, or any other areas where decisions have to be pretty sure in quick time, safety critical, whatever. Timing does influence judgment, but in certain industries where it is part of the day job, it is trained into them to minimize the error of bad judgment. I was influenced by a book called Managing the Unexpected, which looks at the concept of high reliability organizations, those which actually put 5 key attributes in place, such as building resilience. But yes, time does, and the post I put out about the refereeing decisions did get a few people commenting on it, and I'm grateful for it. By the way, if anyone has got any comments on judgment and things, do go into LinkedIn, have a look at my posts on this, and please comment, because I need more comments, and I'm happy to have a dialogue with people on that. But yes, time is almost like a third enemy, but I haven't talked about it in this talk.
Thank you very much. Got a couple of questions around AI. Hugh Purser asks, can AI remove bias? And Douglas Andrews wants some comment about how the increasing application of AI to decision making and will it reduce or potentiate the problems posed by both ignorance and bias?
I think I was expecting a question on AI. I'm a bit of a skeptic, I have to say. A number of people I know on social media telling me it's fantastic, I should do this, I should do that. The thing to remember about artificial intelligence, it's not intelligence, it is artificial. I mean, it is all based on data. So anything you do with AI has been collated from what is already out there. It's not new, it's regurgitated. So anybody in a creative industry or anybody looking for something, ideas in the future, is not going to get an answer in AI. I don't think AI is going to help the risk industry. I could be corrected on that, But given that risk is something that happens in the future, and you have an opinion on whether it is severe or imminent or whatever it's going to be, everyone's got different views on risk. I don't think AI is going to help much, although I'm happy to be corrected on that. I know people who are very, very passionate about its values. From a management point of view, senior management board who have to consider the future. AI will tell you what's been done in the past and will aggregate everything that's ever been written on it. But whether the past is an indication of the future, I'm not so sure.
Thank you very much. Derek Scott has asked how much cognitive bias can be addressed by having cognitive diversity in the composition of boards.
That is a good question. It should be. I think the important thing is how you recruit cognitive diversity. I think the problem with a lot of boards is they like to recruit, although there's talk about diversity, whether it's by like color or ability, disability or sex or whatever it happens to be. However they look at disability visually, mental diversity is a tricky one because you don't see it. You don't see it. How you get somebody who's got a diverse view and bring them into a collective decision process and still not address the issue of dissonance reduction and everything. I mean, I did mention, or I didn't mention on the slide, I didn't talk about this concept of devil's advocate, where you actually say, I want somebody in the group to be constantly looking at the counter arguments, and I want to reward somebody for seeing the problems. I think you can encourage dissenting views and appoint somebody, maybe a different person each meeting, to be that dissenting view. To have somebody on a board who regularly does that becomes an irritant. But having said that, you actually have to think about it. I mean, I've seen on boards where they're looking at a commercial decision and they've got somebody there who's looking at it from a sort of ethical or human or ecological or something that is non-commercial, and there's no easy answers. So yes, you should be able to encourage diversity of opinion. How you manage it within the board structure is a tricky one. You need a benign chair, and you need a tolerant board. And the important thing with a board is their time pressure. If they only meet every 3 or 6 months, they're looking to either get to lunch or get to dinner or get to the train or get the press release out. And it's a shame. So many companies just say, oh, we'll have a strategic away day once a year. It only works if you have an independent facilitator. You break your mindset. So to answer the question, I'm not sure it's easy. I think requesting diversity around the board table is a good thing. But how you live with it and how you work it with it is a difficult one. I think that's my answer.
Thank you very much. And Derek's followed up by saying in the pension space, most boards are consultant-led. Those consultants have biases, and some trustees challenge, but many don't. And I think it's that how do you encourage challenge, which is a key issue. We've got quite a few questions coming in. So I'm going to go with Hugh Purser, who's asked, are whistleblowers just the least biased person in the room?
They are, and they're the bravest, because quite often they don't have the protection they should have, especially if they're up against the culture, which is essentially defensive and has got deep pockets. Yes, I'm all for listening to whistleblowers, especially in organizations which are wealthy and defensive. They should be listened to, and was there the least ignorant? Did he say, or the least biased? Least biased. Yes, indeed. I think when I've looked at some whistleblower cases recently, it's not my specialist area. I'm not in arbitration at all. There are often two sides to a story. Sometimes an individual is not a team player, and yet sometimes there's a role for them in the organization where that is a great thing. Square pegs, round holes, or round pegs, square holes sort of thing. Are you using that person to the best of their ability? because they've got something. If they're brave enough to be a whistleblower, they're an asset, not to be ejected. Find another role for them and listen. It's a tricky one. Yes, I think I would agree. They are the least biased, but you have to find out how will their grievances be addressed. Are they practical to be addressed?
Yeah. Sean Turnbull has got a couple of comments. First of all, he has been a flying instructor and just commented that he's constantly asking pilots of single-engine planes to be identifying where the next forced landing spot is as they fly, so that they're able to manage that risk. But he's also asked the question about how to minimize unknown unknowns, and whether it would be good practice for every board to have politically independent, self-elected, continuous, systematic feedback. Examples like the Citizen Utility Board set up by Ralph Nader. But this idea of how do you get stakeholder voices to counter groupthink, and are there good examples of how that can work?
I don't know any examples. I certainly think the unknown unknowns are things that we have to be aware of. I mean, Rumsfeld said it way back in 2002. And although he said it clumsily, he made a good point. There are things we don't know. So once we think we know them, they fall into a different bucket anyway. I think the important thing on the unknown unknowns is to be aware that even when you go out and try and get perfect knowledge, there will be questions you forgot to ask. I think any organization that is astute enough and alert enough to recognize where its limits are is on the right starting point. I think there is too much hubristic Dunning-Kruger type decision making. I'm the hippo. I'm the highest paid person, is my opinion. And this is, I'm here. I wouldn't be your boss if I wasn't good at my job. Blah blah blah. Too much ego. I think of Trump. Think of Boris Johnson. Whatever. People who are bluffers, but who feel that they don't need to know enough. I think here I'm interested in the pilot chap because I took flying lessons once and it's bloody difficult. I do think it's tricky. I'm not sure how best to say. I haven't seen anything where addressing the unknown unknowns has been fruitful. I think the fact that you recognize them and you put things into those 4 boxes, I think you could do more under if you go back to the matrix of the different ignorances. I wouldn't spend too much time on the unknown unknowns. I think you have to recognize them. Obviously, you have to try and make certain things known that you can, but that's in a different category.
Thank you.
I might not be a very good answer, but I hope I've helped him a bit there.
Just one example of which might have applicability is a lot of health and social care settings, then patient or user experience is explicitly part of the decision-making debate. The service users and patients either sitting on boards or their views regularly represented to boards, which is something perhaps business could take a look at as well.
I've always talked about German companies where you get union representative on boards, statutory. And I think certainly there are certain American organizations which would be horrified at that. But I think it's a very good idea because, how can you make decisions if one of your key stakeholder groups isn't represented at the board table?
Sure.
The whole idea of a board, in my view, is that each board member should be representing a stakeholder group. And if they're not, there's bias.
Nikki Holthausen's asked just briefly, what's your view on intuition?
My view on intuition, and it's interesting having read the Noise book as well, is that it is an asset, but there's a very fine line between intuition and hubris. That all of a sudden you can get somebody so wrapped up in, I've got experience in this, I know what we're doing, I can blah, blah, blah. And the future is never the same as the past. And intuition there's quite a bit on intuition and gut feel in in the noise book, and I'm sure in the new Gerd Gegerenzer book there's a lot more. It's something I'm moving into learning more about myself. My view is it is valuable, but you can be wrong. Even my own daughter said to me recently, I thought I was right about that guy, but I wasn't. You know, we do make decisions based on what we think we know, and sometimes we've deceived ourselves or we've fed ourselves the wrong information. And I think intuition, I go back to when I worked in marketing, developing new products. Sometimes you think, oh, I'll develop this because I'm sure the public want it. But until you test it, you don't know. So intuition is very valuable, but it's only one of the decision-making things you should use. And I think it's a substitute for something more solid.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got just a few more questions to get through quickly. A very encouraging lecture, says Socrates Al-Nasav. He said the methods of reducing bias were particularly interesting, but on similar lines, a table as to how to reduce ignorance may be the next step or the next development.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I will work on that. I will work on that.
Whether it can involve studies of sort of world models in reducing ignorance on business projects and business situations, but I think that's a really good insight.
It is a good. I mean, the matrix I did on ignorance, I first presented to people a couple of months ago, and it went down quite well. It was to a group that was essentially a foresight group, so they like the matrix approach. They like everything pushed into one of four boxes. But I think it does help thinking. It helps the board focus on what they should be doing, rather than wasting time on what they can't solve. And this is where I think risk registers can be a bit of a waste of time sometimes.
Yeah, there are some risks. There are some risks that simply sit at high risk, high impact, and there's nothing to do about them.
I don't like risk matrices, and I don't like risk registers, but that's a whole different ballgame.
Gautam Ghosh has commented, given that not all aspects can be covered by policy, what role has common sense in your spectrum?
Common sense. I like common sense. I think you have to be very careful. Common sense sits in the personal bucket, with familiarity and experience, and what you believe, what you know, what you think. That you should gain that with age, in theory. That's an age thing. That's the argument that says that your president must be over 80, which I think is a bit risky. When you're looking at China or the US, you start looking at age and things in senior people. Common sense, it's a personal attribute, but it comes back to your own personal risk appetite. I mean, I had my own risk. This is a story I got from someone else, but it's true of me. I used to ride a motorbike in central London, and that was my own risk management mechanism. You're making decisions all the time about life and death. So I think for that one, yes, I agree. It's fine. Yeah.
I've got a few quick fire questions, I think, just to end up. Caroline Roberts has said, can you say something about the advantages, but also the potential disadvantages of greater diversity on boards? Her particular interest, of course, is the continuing low representation of women in senior roles. But are there both advantages and disadvantages to diversity?
Well, the advantages are quite clear, that you get views that the corporate, white male over 50, person, you get a view that wasn't there, that it isn't represented. But on the other hand, you sometimes get a view that is not really valuable to that particular business for some reason. I think we must be getting near the end. That's come up.
Just very quickly.
So really, yes, there's great advantage in it, but the disadvantage is how you manage that without it becoming a chaotic boardroom. The question is, are you looking for agreement, or are you looking for the right decision? And sometimes the right decision takes a longer time to get to, and needs. I quote Sloane's thing about, if you've come to the right decision, you've come to the decision now, go away and come back next time when you've thought of some more arguments.
Sure.
when you've thought of the reasons it's wrong. So as long as you get diversity of opinion, that's great. How you get it, there are many ways of getting it. And I'd like to see more women on boards, obviously.
Thank you very much. We haven't quite got through all the questions, but I will pass them over to you. But just
Okay.
briefly, Paul Craven has said he'd highly recommend a book called The Master and His Emissary by Dr. Ian McGilchrist, and then The Matter with Things by the same author, which he believes is some of the best work on the human brain ever. And also, just Paul Craven also notes that Gerd Gigerenzer, an increasing number of behavioural folk are taking issue with Kahneman for overplaying the irrational nature of biases.
Yes, that's
They're
true.
being really
That's true. I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that, and I'm aware of that argument too. So that's why I quote all those sources.
That's super. We have, I'm afraid, run out of time. Many thanks for that contribution, Gary, to our continuing thinking about judgment and how to move judgment forward. Just remains for me to wrap things up. First of all, again, to offer my thanks to our sponsors. We are really grateful for their continuing support, and to note some events coming up. Next Tuesday, New Frontiers in Assistive Tech. On Thursday the 15th, Disabled Entrepreneurs in London and whether they're getting a fair deal. On the 21st of August, taking a positive approach to an older demographic. So do keep an eye on the website for forthcoming events, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks as always to our audience today for your turning up, but also for your engagement. We will make sure we pass on comments and questions to Gary, so if there's a need for further discussion, they can continue. And then thank you, Gary. It's a fascinating session, and we really are grateful for you and your time and your thinking about the unknowns that we need to take into account when we come to judgments. So thank
Thank
you
you
very
all.
much.
Yep.
We look
Thank
forward
you
to
all for
seeing you all.
listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.